Hi, I'm Kate, Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries at Dandridge First United Methodist Church. Thanks for joining us on our 12th video of a study of the Gospel of Mark, broken into 16 parts. Let's jump into the Word. Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." At first sight, this story is about someone giving what they can. It would be easy to interpret this passage as Jesus simply saying, "Give to the church what you can," or "tithe what you can." And ultimately, if you read this passage and that's what you yielded from it, you wouldn't be wrong. However, I would challenge us to read deeper. This isn't a story about tithing to the church, although it may seem like one. This story isn't really even about money. It's about giving despite your circumstances. When Jesus is watching these folks as they give their offerings, he sees some wealthy people throwing large sums of money into the offering plate. Now, obviously, this money can be put to good use in the temple, and in modern times, money like this can significantly help the church run its daily operations. Jesus does not condemn what the rich people give. In fact, he's likely very thankful for it, for their generosity and their gifts. But what he does do is he elevates the poor woman who gives what is hard to part with. You see, the men and the women that threw in these large sums of money, it wasn't hard for them to give this. While it is a large sum of money, it doesn't compare to the sheer amount of wealth they have at their disposal. It doesn't hurt them to give this to the church. Their family won't be left wondering how their bills will be paid. So they're giving out of their abundance. This woman who gives just 2 copper coins, she's a widow. Now, nowadays that doesn't tell us much about someone, but in biblical times, it told nearly everything. See, women didn't typically earn income. So they, as widows, were not just grieving the loss of their loved spouse, but they were also likely suffering in a lot more tangible ways, financially, with things like food and shelter. Essentially, they were struggling to make ends meet. So this widow, who is likely suffering in a multitude of ways, comes to give her offering. She pulls out 2 copper coins. 2 copper coins that were probably very hard for her to come by, and they might have been the only way for her to find sustenance for a little while, and yet she tosses them both into the offering plate. Jesus sees her, and he immediately understands her situation and her sacrifice, and so he uses this as a teachable moment for his disciples. He calls them over, and he says that the widow has put more in the temple treasury than anyone else. The disciples were probably confused at first, and they might have even thought that Jesus needed another math lesson. But Jesus explains that she is giving out of her poverty, out of her shortcomings. Her gift matters so much because she's less concerned with her own needs and more concerned with the needs of God's everlasting work. She's putting God's plan above her own comfort and needs. Now, that might lead you to question, what in the world could the rich givers have done differently to raise their level of gift to the level of that the poor widow gave? How could their gifts ever bear the same weight? Well, the message that Jesus is giving here is that when we give without thinking of ourselves first, when we put God's glory first, when we give out of our own hardship, we are ultimately blessing God. And our giving then bears so much more weight for the kingdom of heaven. So perhaps you're already giving monetarily to the church and you're comfortable with where your tithe is, and that's great. Where else in your life can you give that might allow you to truly prioritize God's plans and purposes over your own? How can you give out of a non-financial poverty? For example, maybe it's your schedule. Maybe you are just so busy with work and family and school and everything else on your plate that it's hard to carve out time for Sunday worship or Sunday school or Bible study. But I promise you that if you prioritize giving some of your very busy schedule over to God, that you're going to hear the Savior say He, in His poverty, put in everything. Or maybe it's that you don't think you could lead just another group. There's just too much on your plate as far as leadership. You just can't do it. But then suddenly there's a spot in the church that could use leadership like yours. And you're starting to feel the stirring of the Spirit, the stirring of a calling. And if you'll just lean into that and give it your very best, I believe that you will hear the Savior say, she in her poverty gave everything. Now you might not remember, but in the Old Testament, many believed that Moses had a speech impediment, something not unlike a stutter. And yet he was called upon to stand up to Pharaoh and to declare that the Israelites should be made free. After they were finally freed from their slavery, Moses is then supposed to lead all of the Israelites. Speaking in front of Pharaoh and then in front of all of God's chosen people is not something that would have ever been comfortable for someone with a speech impediment or stutter to do. And yet, out of his poverty or his hardship, Moses serves God. Now, I don't think that when we get to heaven and we have exhausted everything we have on earth, that we would ever regret emptying ourselves of all that we have for this Savior who will stand before us and welcome us there. And so that leads us to our questions for thought today. First, are you giving all that you have? Second, where can you lean in and offer all that you have to God in a way that glorifies the kingdom first and foremost? Thanks for joining us for our study of Mark chapter 12. I look forward to seeing you next time when we study Mark chapter 13. Between now and then, don't forget to follow us on Facebook so you can hear important church announcements, and you can join us for worship on Sundays at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. either online or in person. Have a blessed week.